Steve Harvey absolutely destroyed a racist contestant who called him a token on live television. And what makes this moment so powerful isn't just what he said. It's what it revealed about prejudice in America. In a single, unguarded moment, this contestant's hidden racism came pouring out. But instead of ignoring it, Steve Harvey did something extraordinary. He didn't just shut the man down. He systematically dismantled his prejudice, exposed his assumptions, and turned a moment of casual racism into a cultural reckoning that millions of people would witness and never forget. The studio was alive with energy that day. You could feel it the moment you walked through those doors. That electric buzz that only happens when millions of people are about to tune in. The lights were bright. Impossibly bright. The kind of lights that make everything feel more important, more real, more consequential than it actually is. The audience was settling into their seats, chatting excitedly, ready for an afternoon of entertainment and surprises. Children were pointing at the set. Couples were holding hands. Families were settling in, ready to be entertained. Everything was perfectly normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. Steve Harvey sat at his desk, looking exactly like he always did. Composed, confident, in complete control of his domain. His presence commanded the room without him even trying. There's something about a man who has spent decades in front of cameras, decades building a brand, decades earning the respect of millions of people. He'd done this thousands of times before. This wasn't his first rodeo. He'd interviewed hundreds of contestants, asked thousands of questions, and navigated every possible awkward moment with the kind of ease that only comes from decades of experience. His suit was immaculate, tailored to perfection, the kind of suit that costs more than most people's cars. His smile was ready. It was the smile of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. He was a man at the absolute peak of his game, completely secure in who he was and what he'd accomplished. And what had he accomplished? Everything. He'd built an empire. He'd gone from a poor kid in Cleveland to becoming one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment. He'd hosted game shows, done stand-up comedy, written books, started a production company. He'd earned respect in an industry that doesn't easily give it. He'd built wealth. He'd built influence. He'd built a legacy that would outlast him. And most importantly, he'd done it all through talent, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Every single thing he had, he'd earned. But backstage, in the green room, a contestant was preparing for his moment in the spotlight. Let's call him the contestant, because his name doesn't matter nearly as much as what he was about to do. He was nervous, sure. Everyone gets nervous before going on television. But his nervousness wasn't the kind that makes you humble or cautious. No. His nervousness was the kind that makes you talk too much, joke too much, and say things you absolutely shouldn't say. It was the kind of nervous energy that loosens your tongue, that makes your filter disappear, that turns your internal thoughts into external words without any of the normal safety mechanisms in place. He sat there, waiting his turn, scrolling through his phone, probably thinking about how he was going to impress Steve Harvey. Maybe he'd prepared some jokes. Maybe he'd thought about what he'd say if he won. Maybe he'd rehearsed some clever comebacks in the mirror that morning. Maybe he'd imagined himself getting a laugh from the audience and becoming a fan favorite. The kind of contestant people would remember and talk about at work the next day. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have realized, was that his entire world was about to change in the worst possible way. That this moment, which he thought would be a highlight of his life, would instead become something he'd spend the rest of his life regretting. Here's what's important to understand about this contestant. He wasn't some obvious villain. He wasn't a card-carrying member of any hate group. He wasn't someone who spent his evenings ranting about other races on the internet. He wasn't the type of person you'd point to and say, "Yeah, that guy's a racist." No. He was something far more common, far more dangerous, and far more insidious. He was an ordinary person carrying ordinary prejudices. The kind of prejudices that hide behind casual comments. The kind of prejudices that masquerade as jokes. The kind of prejudices that people convince themselves aren't really prejudices at all. They're just observations or truths, or just how things are. They're the prejudices that live in the spaces between words, in the assumptions we make without even thinking about them, in the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works. He came from a world where certain assumptions about people were just normal. You didn't question them. You didn't examine them. You didn't sit down and think deeply about whether they were actually true or just something you'd absorbed from your environment. You just accepted them as part of the fabric of how the world worked. And one of those assumptions, one that he'd probably never even articulated out loud before, one that lived in the back of his mind as a kind of unspoken fact, was that successful black people in certain positions must have gotten there because of their race, not because of their talent or work ethic. This is a prejudice that's more common than you might think. It's the assumption that underlies so much of the resentment directed at affirmative action policies, at diversity initiatives, at any effort to level the playing field. It's the idea that if a black person is successful, maybe, just maybe, they didn't really earn it. Maybe they got lucky. Maybe they benefited from some program designed to help minorities. Maybe, deep down, they're not actually as talented as the white people in similar positions. It's a poisonous thought, but it's one that millions of people carry around without even realizing it. He didn't think he was racist. If you'd asked him directly, he would have been offended by the suggestion. He probably would have said he had plenty of black friends. He probably watched shows with black hosts. He probably even voted for policies he thought were fair and colorblind. But underneath all of that, in that shadowy corner of his consciousness that he'd never really examined, that he'd never really shined a light on, lived this thought. Maybe Steve Harvey is here because he's black, not because he's actually good. It was the kind of thought that most people are too careful to say out loud. It's the kind of thought that stays hidden, tucked away, whispered only to people who you think will agree with you. It's the kind of thought that hides behind plausible deniability. It's the kind of thought that allows people to maintain their self-image as good people, while harboring deeply prejudiced beliefs about the world. But this contestant had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea that his filter was about to disappear. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, he would be sitting across from one of the most intelligent, articulate, and quick-witted men in television history, and that his hidden prejudice was about to be dragged into the light for millions of people to see. The minutes ticked by. His turn was getting closer. He could hear the sounds of the show happening just beyond those doors. He could hear Steve's voice, warm and engaging, working the audience, making people laugh. He heard the audience responding, their laughter filling the studio. He could feel the energy building, the anticipation growing. Every moment brought him closer to his moment of glory. Or so he thought. And then, finally, a producer appeared in the doorway. She was holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that comes from having done this 1,000 times before. "You're up next," she said with a smile. "Just head through those doors and we'll get you positioned." He stood up. His legs felt a little shaky. He took a breath, trying to calm his nerves. He smoothed down his shirt. He wanted to look good. He wanted to impress. He was ready. Or at least, he thought he was ready. He had absolutely no idea what was actually about to happen. He had no idea that he was walking toward a moment that would define him, that would be shared millions of times on social media, that would be analyzed and discussed and remembered for years to come. He walked through those doors and into the studio. The lights hit him like a physical force. They were so bright, so intense, that for a moment it was hard to see anything else. But then his eyes adjusted, and he took in the full scope of the moment. The audience applauded. Their clapping filled the air. This was real. This was happening. He was actually here on television, about to be on a show that millions of people would watch. And there, sitting at that desk, was Steve Harvey, the man whose show this was, the man who had built an empire, the man who had earned every bit of success he'd ever achieved. Steve was waiting for him with that famous smile, that smile that had put millions of people at ease over the years. He was completely unaware that this contestant was about to say something that would be replayed millions of times, analyzed by everyone from social media users to cultural critics to academics studying race in America, and remembered as one of the most shocking moments in television history. The contestant walked across the studio floor. He could feel every eye on him. He could feel the weight of the moment. He took his seat across from Steve. The audience settled down. The energy in the room shifted. Something was about to happen. Nobody knew what it would be yet. But everyone could feel that this was a moment that mattered. Steve leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the desk, his expression warm and inviting. He was in his element. This was what he did better than anyone else. Make people comfortable, make them feel heard, make them open up. "So," Steve said, his voice warm and inviting, the kind of voice that had made him one of the most beloved television personalities in America. "Tell me about yourself. Who are you? What brings you here today?" And that's when everything began to change. The contestant leaned back in his chair, trying to look relaxed, trying to project confidence. He smiled at Steve, and Steve smiled back, that warm, welcoming smile that had disarmed thousands of people before him. This was the moment. This was his chance to shine. He opened his mouth to speak. "Well, Steve," he began, his voice a little higher than usual, betraying his nervousness despite his attempts to seem calm. "I've got to say, it's an honor to be here. I've watched your show for years. I mean, everybody knows who you are, right?" Steve nodded, his expression encouraging. This was standard contestant chatter. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest that anything was about to go wrong. Steve had heard variations of this opening thousands of times before. It was the contestant's way of breaking the ice, of establishing a connection, of trying to win Steve over before the actual conversation even began. "Well, I appreciate that," Steve said smoothly. "But I'm more interested in hearing about you. What do you do? What's your story?" This was Steve's gift. His ability to redirect the conversation, to make it about the person sitting across from him, to draw out their authentic self. He wasn't interested in flattery. He was interested in the real person, and that's what made him so effective. People felt seen when they talked to Steve Harvey. They felt heard. They felt like their story mattered. But the contestant wasn't really listening to what Steve was asking. Or maybe he was listening. But he was too caught up in his own nervousness, too focused on saying the right thing, too anxious about making a good impression. He launched into his story. Something about his job, his family, his life back home. It It was the kind of story that millions of people could relate to. It was ordinary. It was real. And it was exactly the kind of thing that Steve used to connect with his guests. Steve listened intently, asking follow-up questions, showing genuine interest. He was doing what he always did, making the contestant feel comfortable, making him feel like his story mattered, creating the kind of environment where people naturally open up and share more than they probably intended to share. And that's when it happened. The contestant was in the middle of talking about his job, about how he'd worked his way up in his field, about how he'd earned his position through hard work and dedication. And then he said something. It was a small thing. It was a casual thing. It was the kind of thing that most people wouldn't even notice. But it was also the kind of thing that, once said, could never be unsaid. I mean, it's not like I got my job because of some diversity hire program or something, he said, laughing nervously. I actually earned my position. You know what I mean? The words hung in the air. The audience didn't laugh. There was no sound at all, actually. Just silence. The kind of silence that only happens when something has been said that shouldn't have been said. When a line has been crossed that everyone in the room recognizes has been crossed. Steve's expression didn't change. His smile was still there, but something had shifted in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. A recognition, an understanding, a moment where he realized exactly what was happening. What do you mean by that? Steve asked, his voice still calm, still measured, but with an edge to it now, the kind of edge that comes when someone has detected something beneath the surface and is about to start digging. The contestant hesitated. He seemed to sense that he'd said something wrong, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. Or maybe he was sure exactly what it was. And he was trying to figure out if he could backtrack, if he could somehow undo the words that had just come out of his mouth. I just mean, you know, the contestant stammered. I worked hard to get where I am. I didn't get any special treatment or anything. Steve said, nodding slowly. And you're implying that I did? There it was. Steve had said it out loud. He'd named the thing that the contestant had been implying without quite saying it directly. And now there was nowhere for the contestant to hide. No, that's not what I meant, the contestant said. But his voice was less confident now. He was backpedaling. He could sense that he'd made a mistake, that he'd wandered into territory he shouldn't have wandered into. So what did you mean? Steve pressed, his voice gentle but firm. He wasn't being aggressive. He wasn't being loud. But he was being relentless. This was Steve Harvey at his best. Intelligent, articulate, refusing to let someone off the hook when they'd revealed something true about themselves, something real, something that needed to be examined. The contestant tried to clarify, tried to explain, tried to walk it back. But the more he talked, the more it became clear that his initial comment hadn't been accidental. There was something there, some belief, some assumption, some prejudice that had slipped out past his filter. And that's when things really started to escalate. You know what? Steve said, leaning back in his chair, his expression serious now. Let me ask you something. Do you think I'm successful because I'm black? Or do you think I'm successful because I'm good at what I do? The question hung in the air like a challenge. And the audience was completely silent now. Everyone in the studio could feel the shift in the energy. This wasn't banter anymore. This wasn't casual conversation. This was something real. This was something important. This was a moment where hidden prejudices were about to be brought into the light. The contestant's face had gone pale. He realized now exactly what had happened. He'd made an assumption, a racist assumption, and he'd let it slip out in front of millions of people. And now he was sitting across from someone who wasn't going to let him off easy. Someone who was going to make him confront what he'd just revealed about himself. I think you're good at what you do, the contestant said weakly. You think? Steve repeated, emphasizing the word. Or you know? Because here's the thing, I've been doing this for decades. I've built an empire, I've won awards, I've earned the respect of people all over the world. So the question isn't whether I'm good at what I do. The question is, why would you even suggest that I might not be? The tension in the room was palpable now. You could feel it. The audience members were leaning forward in their seats. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Some of them looked angry on Steve's behalf. Some of them looked fascinated, watching this moment unfold in real time, knowing that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be remembered. The contestant tried to respond, but Steve wasn't done. He was just getting started. And this is where things were about to get really interesting. Because, Steve continued, his voice calm but with an underlying current of controlled anger, what you just implied, what you revealed about how you think, is that you believe a black man couldn't possibly have earned his success on merit alone. That there must be something else involved. Some program, some special treatment, some advantage that I got because of my race. He paused, letting that sink in. The silence was deafening. That, Steve said, leaning forward now, his eyes locked on the contestants, is racism. It's not the most obvious kind. It's not the kind that involves slurs or violence, but it's racism nonetheless. It's the assumption that a black person's success must be unearned. It's the belief that we need some kind of asterisk next to our achievements. It's the idea that we didn't really deserve what we have. The contestant opened his mouth to say something, but Steve held up his hand. And here's what really bothers me about that, Steve continued, his voice rising slightly now, passion bleeding through his controlled exterior, is that you said this to my face. You said this in front of millions of people. You walked out here, sat down across from me, and revealed that you think I'm a token, that I'm not really qualified, that I'm not really good enough. The words were hitting hard now. The contestant's face was getting redder. You could see the realization dawning on him, the full scope of what he'd done, the magnitude of his mistake, the fact that there was no way out of this except to face it head on. And Steve wasn't going to let him off easy. Not now. Not after revealing such a fundamental prejudice. Not after showing the millions of people watching exactly what hidden racism looks like when it's exposed. So, let me make something crystal clear, Steve said, his voice like steel now, controlled and powerful and absolutely devastating. I'm not a token. I'm not here because of affirmative action or diversity initiatives or any other program. I'm here because I'm excellent at what I do. And the fact that you can't see that, the fact that you assumed otherwise, says everything about your prejudice and absolutely nothing about my qualifications. The audience erupted. People were standing up, clapping, some of them shouting in agreement. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as a casual conversation had turned into something else entirely. It had turned into a moment of reckoning. The contestant sat frozen in his seat, his face burning, his eyes watering, fully realizing now the scope of his mistake and the beginning of the consequences he was about to face. And Steve Harvey, composed, intelligent, articulate Steve Harvey was just getting warmed up. Steve Harvey didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because this wasn't just about one contestant anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about calling out the kind of prejudice that hides in plain sight, that masquerades as innocence, that destroys people's self-worth by suggesting that their achievements don't matter, that they're not real, that they're somehow less than. The contestant was visibly shaken now. His hands were trembling. He was trying to shrink into his chair, trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear. But there was nowhere to hide. He was on national television, sitting across from one of the most articulate and intelligent men in the entertainment industry. And that man was about to dismantle every assumption he'd ever made about success, about race, about fairness in America. "You know what really gets me?" Steve said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more intense because of it. "You came out here. You sat down in this chair. And the first thing you did was try to establish common ground with me by talking about how you worked hard for your position. And do you know why you did that?" The contestant didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His jaw was clenched. "You did it," Steve continued, "because you needed me to understand that you earned your success, that you're not a token, that you didn't get handed anything. And that's fine. That's a fair thing to want people to understand about you. But here's the problem. You felt the need to establish that to me. You felt like you needed to prove to me that you were worthy of your position." Steve paused, letting that sink in. "And I'm wondering, when was the last time you felt you had to do that with a white person? When was the last time you sat down across from someone and felt compelled to defend your achievements, to prove that you earned what you have, to make sure they understood that you're not just a token hire?" The audience was completely silent now. They weren't clapping. They weren't cheering. They were witnessing something. They were watching a moment of profound truth-telling unfold in real time. They were watching someone be held accountable for their prejudices in a way that very few people ever are. The contestant's eyes had filled with tears now. Whether they were tears of shame or anger or frustration, it was hard to say. But they were there, streaming down his face, a physical manifestation of the emotional devastation he was experiencing. "I think," Steve said, his voice carrying a note of something almost like sympathy, but not quite. It was more like the sympathy of a teacher for a student who's about to learn a very difficult lesson. "That what you need to understand is that I've spent my entire life in a world where people question my qualifications, where people wonder if I'm really good enough, where people assume that if I have something, it's because I got special treatment." He stood up from his chair. The studio went even quieter, if that was possible. Steve Harvey, standing, commanding the room with his physical presence as well as his words. "And I've spent my entire life proving them wrong." He continued, pacing slightly, his movements controlled and deliberate. "I've spent my entire life being excellent. At comedy, at hosting, at connecting with people, at building a business empire, at earning the respect of people all over the world." He turned back to face the contestant directly. "And you know what the worst part is?" Steve asked. "The worst part is that even with all of that, even with all of that success, all of that respect, all of those accomplishments, there are still people like you who sit down and wonder if maybe, just maybe, I didn't really earn it. If maybe I got lucky. If maybe I benefited from some program or some quota or some initiative designed to help minorities." The contestant was full-on crying now. His shoulders were shaking. He looked completely devastated, completely broken by the weight of what was happening. "And do you know what that is?" Steve asked. his voice like a hammer driving a nail. That's the real racism, not the obvious kind, not the kind that makes headlines or gets people arrested. The real racism is the assumption that a black person's success is inherently questionable, that it needs to be verified, that it needs to be proven, that it's somehow less legitimate than a white person's success. Steve sat back down, but he didn't relax. His posture was still rigid, still commanding, still completely in control of the room and the narrative. "I want you to think about something," Steve said to the contestant, his voice quieter now, almost conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. "I want you to think about how many times in your life you've questioned a white person's qualifications. How many times you've wondered if they were just a token hire. How many times you've assumed that they didn't really earn their position." The contestant didn't answer. He couldn't. The answer was obviously 0. "Exactly," Steve said, as if the contestant had answered. "You've never done that. Because you don't question white people's achievements. You assume they earned them. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You assume competence until proven otherwise." He leaned forward again. "But me? You question me immediately. You suggest that maybe I got some special treatment. You imply that maybe I'm not really qualified. You make me prove myself to you in a way that you would never ask a white person to prove themselves." The words were landing like blows now. The contestant was absolutely destroyed. His face was buried in his hands. His shoulders were heaving with sobs. "And you don't even see it," Steve continued, his voice rising now, passion overflowing his usual composure. "You don't even understand what you're doing. You think you're being fair. You think you're being objective. You think you're just asking reasonable questions. But what you're actually doing is perpetuating a system of racism that has been in place for centuries." The audience was completely enraptured now. Some people had tears in their eyes, too. Some people looked angry. Some people looked like they were witnessing a moment of profound moral clarity, a moment where truth was being spoken to power, where someone was finally saying out loud what so many people feel, but are afraid to articulate. "So here's what I need you to understand," Steve said, his voice returning to that controlled, measured tone, but somehow even more powerful because of it. "I didn't destroy you today because I'm angry. I destroyed you today because you needed to be confronted with your own prejudice. You needed to understand, in a very real and very public way, what it feels like to have your achievements questioned, to have your legitimacy challenged, to have your success attributed to anything other than your own merit and hard work." He paused, his eyes locked on the contestants. "And maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice before you do that to someone else again. Maybe you'll think about this moment the next time you encounter a successful black person and you feel that little voice in the back of your head suggesting that they're a token, that they got lucky, that they didn't really deserve what they have. Maybe you'll remember sitting in this chair, having your prejudice exposed in front of millions of people, and you'll recognize that voice for what it is. Racism. Casual racism. Hidden racism. But racism nonetheless. The studio was absolutely silent. The contestant was completely broken. And Steve Harvey, having said everything that needed to be said, sat back in his chair, his expression calm, his demeanor composed, but with the unmistakable aura of someone who had just delivered a masterclass in moral courage and truth-telling. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, and then building in intensity. People were standing up. People were shouting. This wasn't just applause. It was a kind of collective acknowledgement that something important had just happened, that a line had been drawn, that someone had finally said what needed to be said in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed or explained away. And the contestant sat there. Destroyed, his prejudices exposed, his assumptions shattered, forced to confront the reality of who he was and what he believed in, a way that would probably haunt him for the rest of his life. But Steve wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing that needed to happen. There was still one final blow that needed to be delivered. Steve Harvey leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to let the applause die down. His expression was serious, thoughtful, the kind of expression you see on someone's face when they're about to say something that they've been thinking about for a very long time. Something that goes deeper than just one contestant. Something that speaks to a larger truth about how the world works. The contestant was still sitting there, completely devastated. His hands were covering his face. His entire body was shaking. The security guards were watching him closely, ready to step in if needed. But for now, they were giving him space to sit with what had just happened to him. "You know," Steve said, his voice calm and measured, speaking now not just to the contestant, but to the audience, to the millions of people watching at home, to anyone who had ever felt this way about a successful black person in any position of power or influence. "I want to talk about something that's been bothering me for a very long time." He stood up again, pacing now with the kind of deliberate movement of someone who is about to deliver a sermon, someone who understands the power of physical presence combined with intellectual authority. "This idea of the token," Steve said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience, years of observation, years of watching how this narrative plays out in America again and again and again. It's a concept that was invented specifically to delegitimize the success of black people in positions of prominence. He turned to face the contestant directly. "Because here's the thing that people like you don't seem to understand," Steve said. "When a white man becomes successful, nobody questions it. Nobody wonders if he got help. Nobody suggests that maybe he's just a token hire. Nobody assumes that there's something artificial about his success." Steve walked closer to the contestant now, his presence almost overwhelming in its intensity. "But when a black man becomes successful, suddenly there are all these questions. Suddenly there's this assumption that something is off, something is wrong, something must have been rigged in his favor. And do you know why that is?" The contestant didn't answer. He couldn't. "It's because," Steve continued, his voice rising now with passion, "America was built on a foundation of white supremacy. It was built on the idea that white people are better than black people, smarter than black people, more deserving than black people. And even though we've made progress, even though we've passed laws, even though we've fought battles, even though we've come a long way, that foundational belief is still there. It's still embedded in the culture. It's still embedded in people's minds." He paused, letting that sink in. "And so when a black person becomes successful, the natural instinct for people who've been raised in that system is to question it, to find some explanation for it that doesn't involve the fact that black people are just as capable, just as intelligent, just as deserving as white people. And that explanation is the token." Steve returned to his seat, but he didn't sit back and relax. He sat forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression intense. "The token is a beautiful concept, really, if you think about it," Steve said, his voice dripping with irony. "It allows people to maintain their worldview while still acknowledging the existence of successful black people. It allows them to say, oh, that person is successful, but they're just a token. They're just here to make the system look good. They're not representative of the real competence levels of their race." He gestured broadly. It's a way to have it both ways. It's a way to accept the reality of black success while still maintaining the belief that black people are generally inferior. It's racist, but it's polite racism. It's racist, but it sounds reasonable. It's racist, but it allows people to sleep at night believing that they're not actually racist. They're just being objective. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "But here's what really grinds my gears," Steve said, his voice becoming harder, more cutting, "is that tokens don't exist. They can't exist. Because I didn't get where I am through some quota system. I didn't get where I am because the network needed to fill some diversity requirement. I got where I am because I'm good. I got where I am because I work harder than most people. I got where I am because I have talent, intelligence, and a work ethic that is second to none." He stood up again, unable to contain his energy now. "And you know what? Every successful black person you can name could say the same thing. Oprah Winfrey is not a token. She built an empire from nothing. She's one of the richest women in the world. She earned that through excellence. Barack Obama is not a token. He went to Harvard Law School. He was a constitutional scholar. He was a senator. He earned his way to the presidency." Steve's voice was getting louder now, more forceful, more commanding. "But people like you, people who are so invested in the idea that black people don't deserve their success. You'll look at Oprah and you'll say she got lucky with her talk show. You'll look at Barack Obama and you'll say he benefited from affirmative action. You'll look at me and you'll say I'm a token. Because admitting that we earned our success, that we deserve to be where we are, that we're just as capable and intelligent and talented as any white person who's ever achieved anything, that's something you're not ready to do." The contestant was absolutely destroyed now. He looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. "And do you know what the most insidious part of this is?" Steve asked, his voice suddenly quieter, but somehow even more intense. "It's that you probably don't even realize you're doing it. You probably go through life thinking that you're a fair person, that you don't see color, that you judge people on their merits. But you don't. You judge black people on their merits, and then you add an extra layer of scrutiny on top of that. You judge white people on their merits, and you give them the benefit of the doubt." He sat back down, his energy still intense, but his physical posture more controlled. "And that's what we call systemic racism," Steve continued. "It's not about individual acts of racism, although those happen too. It's about a system where black people have to work twice as hard to get half as far. It's about a system where our achievements are always questioned, always scrutinized, always assumed to be unearned." Steve looked directly at the contestant, and his expression was almost pitying now. "And you," Steve said, "are a perfect example of how that system perpetuates itself. You came out here today, you sat down across from me, and you revealed that you believe in that system. You revealed that you believe a black man's success is questionable. You revealed that you think I'm a token. And in doing so, you've shown the entire world exactly how this racism works, how it hides, how it disguises itself as reasonable doubt." The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "So here's what I want you to do," Steve said, his voice firm and commanding. "I want you to go home. I want you to think about every successful black person you know. And I want you to ask yourself, did I assume they earned their success, or did I assume they got lucky? Did I assume they were qualified, or did I assume they benefited from some program? Did I give them the benefit of the doubt, or did I assume they were tokens?" Steve paused. "And when you've done that," he continued, "I want you to think about what that says about you. I want you to think about what that says about the prejudices you've been carrying around inside you, hidden from view, disguised as objectivity. And I want you to decide right now whether you're going to spend the rest of your life perpetuating that system, or whether you're going to do the hard work of examining your beliefs and changing them. The contestant was now completely broken. He looked like he might throw up. His entire worldview had been shattered. Everything he thought he believed about himself, that he was a fair person, that he was objective, that he didn't have racist beliefs, had been demolished in front of millions of people. Because here's the thing, Steve said, his voice becoming almost gentle now, but with an undertone of steel. I'm not angry at you because you're a bad person. I'm not angry at you because you're some kind of monster. I'm angry at you because you're ordinary. You're an average American who's been socialized to believe certain things about race, and you let those beliefs slip out today. And that's what we need to address in this country. Not the obvious racists. They're easy to identify and dismiss. But the ordinary, people who carry ordinary prejudices that they don't even recognize as prejudices. He stood up one final time, his presence commanding the entire room. So, congratulations, Steve said, his voice dripping with irony. You've had the privilege today of being confronted with your own racism on national television. You've had the privilege of being forced to see yourself the way millions of people see you. And you've had the privilege of realizing that your assumptions about a black man's success are rooted in prejudice, not fact. Steve walked back to his chair and sat down. Now the question is, he said, what are you going to do with that knowledge? The contestant sat frozen, tears streaming down his face, completely unable to respond, completely unable to defend himself, completely unable to do anything except sit with the reality of who he was and what he believed. And the audience, the millions of people watching at home, sat with it too. They sat with the discomfort. They sat with the truth. They sat with the recognition that what they had just witnessed was a moment of profound moral reckoning, a moment where someone had been forced to confront the racism that lives inside them, a moment that would reverberate far beyond this one contestant, far beyond this one show, into the culture itself. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that happens when people don't know what to say. It was the kind of silence that happens when people know exactly what's been said, when they understand the magnitude of what they've just witnessed, and they're still processing it, still absorbing it, still letting it settle into their consciousness. The producers backstage were in chaos. They were looking at each other, their eyes wide, their hands shaking slightly. This wasn't what they'd expected when they'd booked this contestant. This wasn't the kind of television that networks usually wanted on the air. This was dangerous television. This was the kind of television that made people uncomfortable, that challenged their assumptions, that forced them to look at themselves in ways they weren't prepared for. But it was also the kind of television that people would remember, the kind of television that would be clipped and shared and discussed for years to come, the kind of television that mattered. The contestant was still sitting in his chair, completely devastated. His publicist, if he even had one, was probably having a heart attack somewhere. This was a disaster for him. This was the kind of public humiliation that follows you for the rest of your life. This was the kind of moment that defines you, that becomes your identity, that overshadows everything else you've ever accomplished or ever will accomplish. But Steve Harvey wasn't done. He sat there, completely composed, his expression serious but calm, like a man who had just done what needed to be done and was now watching the consequences unfold naturally. "You can go," Steve said to the contestant, his voice not unkind, but absolutely final. "I think we're done here." The contestant stood up on shaky legs. He looked like he might collapse at any moment. The audience watched in complete silence as he made his way across the studio floor, past the cameras, toward the exit. Some people in the audience were clapping, slow, measured claps that sounded almost like judgment. But most people were just watching, absorbing, understanding that they had just witnessed something that would change the trajectory of this man's life forever. And as the contestant disappeared backstage, the weight of what had just happened settled over the studio like a blanket. Steve took a moment. He didn't immediately pivot to the next segment. He didn't try to lighten the mood with a joke or a commercial break. Instead, he sat there, and he let the moment breathe. He let the audience sit with what they'd just seen. He let them understand that this wasn't entertainment. This was something more serious, something more important, something that actually mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 30 seconds, Steve spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying through the studio with a kind of authority that only comes from someone who has earned the respect of millions of people. "I want to talk about what just happened here." The audience leaned forward, completely enraptured. "What you witnessed," Steve continued, "was not me being mean to someone. It was not me being cruel or unfair or taking out my frustrations on an innocent person. What you witnessed was accountability. What you witnessed was someone being forced to confront the racism that lives inside them, that they've probably never had to confront before, that they've probably spent their entire lives being unaware of." He stood up and walked to the front of the stage, addressing the audience directly now, abandoning the normal structure of the show to have a real conversation about something that actually mattered. "And I want to be clear about something," Steve said, his voice firm and commanding. "This is not about that one contestant. This is about America. This is about a country that was built on racism, that has spent centuries trying to maintain a racial hierarchy, and that still hasn't fully reckoned with what that means and what the consequences of that are." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "Because here's what I know," Steve continued. "There are millions of people watching this right now who have that same thought in their head, who have that same question about whether a black person's success is real, or whether it's just affirmative action, or diversity hiring, or luck. And they've never had to confront it the way this contestant just did. They've never had to sit across from someone who's going to call them out on it." He paused, letting that sink in. "And maybe that's what needs to happen," Steve said. "Maybe America needs to have a reckoning with these hidden prejudices. Maybe people need to be confronted with their own racism in a way that makes it impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to explain away." Steve returned to his desk and sat down, but his energy was still high, still intense, still completely commanding the room. "But here's what I also want to say," he continued. "And I want to be really clear about this because it's important. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm not seeking revenge. What I'm seeking is understanding. What I'm seeking is for people to actually look at how this country works, to actually examine the assumptions they've been making about race, to actually do the hard work of confronting their own prejudices." He leaned back in his chair. "Because that's the only way we're going to change," Steve said. "Not through laws, although laws help. Not through policies, although policies help. But through individuals, through people like that contestant, actually doing the internal work of examining their beliefs and deciding whether they want to continue perpetuating a racist system or whether they want to be part of something better." The studio was absolutely still. You could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was happening, the understanding that this was a conversation that needed to happen in America. A conversation that very few people were having, a conversation that Steve Harvey had just forced into the national consciousness, whether people were ready for it or not. "And I'm going to tell you something else," Steve said, his voice becoming more passionate, more intense, more raw. "I've spent my entire life working in an industry where people questioned my competence. I've spent my entire life being one of the few black people in rooms where decisions were being made about entertainment, about media, about culture. And do you know what that's like?" He didn't wait for an answer. "It's exhausting," he said, his voice carrying the weight of those decades of experience. "It's exhausting to always have to be twice as good. It's exhausting to always have to prove yourself. It's exhausting to always have to wonder if people are accepting you because of your talent or in spite of your race. It's exhausting to carry that burden." Steve's voice was becoming more emotional now. But it wasn't the emotion of someone breaking down. It was the emotion of someone speaking a deep truth, a truth that they've been holding inside for a very long time. "And that's what I want people to understand," he continued. "When you question a black person's qualifications, when you suggest that they might be a token, when you imply that their success might be unearned, you're adding to that burden. You're making their life harder. You're making them doubt themselves. You're participating in a system that has been designed to make black people feel like they don't belong, like they don't deserve what they have, like they're not good enough." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I'm tired of that," Steve said, his voice becoming quieter, but somehow even more powerful. "I'm tired of carrying that burden. And I think America needs to be tired of perpetuating that system." The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, and then building in intensity. But this wasn't the kind of applause you hear at the end of a game show or after a funny joke. This was the kind of applause that comes when people have heard a truth spoken that they needed to hear, a truth that makes them uncomfortable, a truth that they're going to carry with them long after they leave the studio. And Steve Harvey sat there, composed and dignified, having just delivered one of the most important monologues of his career, having just done something that very few people in positions of power and privilege are willing to do: use that power and privilege to call out racism, to demand accountability, to push for real change.